So, welcome to Frontline Nursing, a Nurse Minder production that gives you an insider's look into the daily life of nursing from those who are currently working on the front lines. Whether you're considering nursing as a profession, you are a student already, or you are a nurse in transition looking for a new patient population, or in this case, a new geographical location, this show will give you some behind the scenes information to help you guide your career. Today on Frontline Nursing, we are joined by Louise Kemme. She is a registered nurse with her master's, and she is currently working in Australia as a head of nursing in a private college. Welcome to the show, Louise.
Thanks, Tammy.
I'm so excited to catch up with you.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a while. So for those who are listening, I'll just let you know we used to work together back at Northwest College way back. It feels like forever ago.
Mhm.
Because you've been in this sunny location for a little while.
Yeah, I have been. It's been about 3.5 years now, but this was actually the second time I've come back to Australia. So I immigrated to Australia in 2013, spent a year enjoying the sunshine and traveling around, and then I went back to Canada, which is where I ended up meeting you for a couple of years, and now I've returned to Australia on a more permanent basis.
That's really
So,
exciting.
mhm.
I want to talk about that transition in particular. And then, of course, I want to talk about the differences you've noticed between the two countries in terms of processes and language, all those kind of things. But let's just take a step back. First of all, what made you think Australia?
I was always interested in travel nursing. Always kind of thought New Zealand in the back of my mind. And then my boyfriend at the time, he was looking into going to school overseas, and he was looking into Australia. So he asked me if he ended up getting school accepted into a school and university in Australia, would I follow him? And I said, "Oh, Australia and New Zealand, close enough. I could probably visit the other country." So I said yes, and he went to Australia. And then a year later, I followed him. And so that's how I kind of got introduced to Australia. I followed a boy.
Yeah, that's awesome. Now, was that when you first went down there? That was your first year block there?
That was the first year block, yeah.
Okay.
So you are limited with visas, with work visas. And so after a year, I had to return back to Canada.
Okay. I was going to
Um,
ask how you got there the first time. I wasn't sure if it was vacation, if it was work.
yeah, so with regards to the visas, there's almost every country in the world has something called a work holiday visa. Um, and that's the visa you want to look for. Now, most countries have 2-year work holiday visas. And the idea with the visa is that you are working to fund your travels and exploration of the country, which is why it's a very short-term visa. With that being said, like I said, most are 2-year visas, but Australia actually has some restrictions on theirs. It's a 1-year visa, but if you spend 3 months full-time working on a remote farm in the middle of nowhere, you can extend your visa to 2 years.
Okay. So I'm
I
guessing
know.
that wasn't in your plan, the remote farm.
I did it for a chunk of time. I did about 2 months worth of the work. I worked on a goat farm, feeding baby goats. So it was quite the experience, but I didn't make it up to the 3 months because they're extremely strict with how many days and hours that you have to work. And you aren't it. A lot of nurses that travel to Australia wonder, oh, can I do remote nursing instead? And the answer is a black and white no. The government is very specific in the jobs you're allowed to do. It can't be nannying. It can't be nursing. It must be actual physical farm labor. And that's realistically, that's how they, in the fruit picking season and stuff, that's how they, staff their farms for this.
Hmm. So they could come on the 1-year work visa and work nursing, but they wouldn't get it extended to 2 years.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct.
Did you also work nursing when you were down there for that 1 year?
Absolutely, absolutely. I worked what's called agency nursing. I have seen hints of agency nursing within pockets of Canada, but it's a little bit different. The US tends to have a much better concept of agency nursing, but again, it's still a little bit different than Australia's. So, agency nursing in Australia is basically the same concept as supply teaching in Canada. So, as a supply teacher, you could get called in to teach any grade in any school within reason of what you're comfortable teaching. And you have the right to say no.
Mhm.
Same goes with agency nursing in Australia. You can be called in to work in any hospital on any ward based on your experience and based on what you're comfortable. So, obviously, the more variety of experience you have, the better. So, when you first sign up with a work agency, you put your name down to say what you are comfortable working. And the thing to keep in mind is that this is your license on the line, and the agency staff themselves are just office workers. So they have no judging, they don't judge you, your experience. It's entirely up to you. So you can tick yourself off as, yes, I'm willing to work on a cardiology ward. I'm willing to work on a surgical ward, a medical ward. Am I willing to work with pediatrics or not? And that's just based on your decision. And then if and when these shifts become available, they notify you and you choose whether you are willing to work on that ward or not. I actually really loved it because I had, first of all, I had some great experiences, but the days where you do have a really bad experience on that ward, you have the right in the future to say, I'm not going back,
Mhm.
because it's just a one-off shift.
Yeah, that's
And
amazing.
yeah, absolutely. And that was one thing I found. I was treated so respectfully by the nurses when I was on the ward, because obviously I'm coming in as a foreigner. I don't know what I'm doing. Like, you just hit the ground running with the shift. You haven't really had any training in that hospital or on that ward. Um, and after a while, I started recognizing that the nurses were always assigning me the easiest patients to look after.
What?
No, which is the total opposite of what float nursing in Canada is like, where you get the heaviest because you're not a
Yeah,
part of the team,
yeah.
which is what I kind of been anticipating. So I'm like, I actually approached the nurses and I said, why? I know you don't know me, but why do you always give me the easiest patients? And it's not just this particular ward, it's every single facility I go to. And their reasoning, and I really wish the Canadian nurses had the same mindset with float nurses. Their reasoning was, look, we were short staffed. We were about to work short staffed before you agreed to come and pick up the shift with us. If we don't treat you right, you have the right to say you won't come back. And the next time we will be working short staffed. So we would rather treat you right in the first place and give you the easier patients so you're willing to come back. And I'm
Yeah,
like, I love that.
I like see people writing down "move to Australia" as they're listening to this podcast.
Yeah.
So
Now that was agency nursing. And what I have learned since, now that I've moved more permanently, is there are agency nurses tend to be foreign nurses
mhm.
from a variety of countries. And Canadian nurses are considered extremely well trained and educated compared to other international nurses. So the other side of the coin as to why they always give agency nurses the easier patients is because they recognize that there tends to be a lack of training in some aspects, and they don't want to risk giving more challenging patients to nurses that they don't know what their education level is.
Mm,
And again, that goes back to what I said with when you get employed by an agency, the staff at the office have no judgment call over what your work and experience is.
mhm. I was going to ask what kind of training and orientation you got with the agency. So I'm assuming there's got to be a little bit of orientation in terms of making sure you've got baseline skills in place, or no?
Um, two training days essentially, or two training things. They make sure you've got your basic life support and CPR, and manual handling, so moving the patient safely. But that's it.
No, looking at paperwork. I suppose every unit's different, anyways. But
Yeah, which is why, and I'm on some Facebook groups, and I really encourage anybody looking to immigrate to Australia or any other country, particularly if you're going to do agency. I picked up mostly night shifts for the first few months because on night shifts, it's a lot. You have a lot more time to get comfortable with the paperwork, and you have more time to research your medications because the drug names are different, the paperwork is different. Um, You cross your fingers. You have more patience, but if you're lucky, they're sleeping, which gives you more time to process stuff, as opposed to when you come on a morning shift or a day shift and you're expected to hit the ground running and know what you're doing.
Hmm.
Um, so I mostly picked up night shifts to begin with, and then once I'd done a few night shifts on a particular ward, I would start switching to day shifts on that ward where I was more once I knew the paperwork and expectations.
Hmm. I'm thinking of the time difference as well. So right now it's 5 o'clock my time, and that would be
9 a.m. here
9 a.m.
on,
And we're on different days, by the way. So I'm on,
yeah,
I'm
you're
on,
Thursday and I'm Friday.
I'm
You
on
are,
April 16th, and you're on April 17th.
yep, you're talking to the future.
I know, that's so wild. But that made me think that night shifts would be even easier to transition with the time zone difference because of that circadian rhythm.
Yep. Um, when you actually, it's really interesting, and I'm not an expert with this, but it's got to do with when you travel. When you fly from Canada to Australia, you're exhausted from the travel, but you're pretty much able to pick yourself up and go and switch over time zone wise once you land in Australia after you've had a good night's sleep. But when you go the opposite, when you go Australia to Canada, the jet lag for the next week is just awful. It's only the one direction. It's weird.
I think that may be a mental part. I don't want to go back to Canada.
It could be. Although it is winter here right now. So it's actually getting kind of it's getting nicer in Canada than it is where I live in Australia.
Let's talk about that. What does winter look like there? Because for us today, it's probably 2 degrees. Celsius. Do you guys use Celsius down there?
Yep, yep. Australians are complete metric system, way more than even Canadians. They have no concept of the imperial system, which means when somebody asks me my height and I go, oh, I'm like 5'3", they're like, what? So you're talking centimeters, you're talking kilograms, you're talking Celsius. In regards to the weather, it really, really depends on what end of the country you live in.
I have seen that, yeah.
It is quite a large country, and it's where Canada is very long, but Australia is very tall, which means your south weather, obviously closer to the Antarctic, is very different than the north end of the country that's much closer to the equator. So if you are, okay, let's say you're in the middle kind of level of the country, Brisbane sort of area, you're probably looking at about 35 to 40 degrees during the summer and a low of 20 degrees in the winter, which is pretty sweet.
Okay, I'm pulling up a map so I can see and visualize this. And I'll share it because then we can talk a little bit about it maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's just see. I'm going to share my screen over there. Now, I know that for the people who are just listening on the podcast, they're not going to see this, but for those who are in the membership area, you know that you can see the video afterwards. So we're going to share this video. Okay, let me make this a little bigger.
Yep.
Oh, too big. I'm probably looking at your house right now.
All right. So do you see the Queensland? You see Brisbane down on the right there?
Yes, yes.
That's about what I'd call the middle level of the country. So you're looking at in the summer, 35 to 40 degrees, 30 on the nicer days. It's really good surfing conditions there if you're into that. And winter drops to a cool low of 20 degrees Celsius. So it's pretty comfy. If
Sounds
it was
like
up to
my kind of place.
that's where I'd live. Now,
that's not where you live, apparently.
no, where I live, if you scroll your map down.
Oh no!
Yeah. There you go. I live near Melbourne, which, as you can see, it's not the most southern part of the country. Tasmania is, but it's still quite further south. In the winter here, it drops to about 1 degree at nighttime, and it goes to a high of about 10 degrees during the day, which compared to Canadian winter, you'd be like, meh, not bad. But I actually prefer Canadian winter 110% because it rains. And rain when it's like 8 degrees outside and the houses are not well insulated. It's just damp and cold and quite, I prefer Canadian winters where, yes, it's very cold, but when you enter your house, it's quite warm.
Yes, okay.
Australians, I'm like, you guys have the technology to insulate your houses better. Why don't you do it better? And they're like, oh, we just don't like to believe that we need to do it, that it gets cold enough.
Oh my goodness. So that's interesting to know. I had no idea about that aspect. So it's almost like a Victoria, Vancouver kind of winter with all the rain.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Okay. And then the summers are,
Summers are about 30 degrees and sunny for 4 months, no rain. So it's absolutely, the summers are amazing here, I have to say. And then at the very top, you can see Northern Territory, Darwin, yep, right around where your mouse is. They tend to be about 30 to 40 degrees all year round. Their temperature actually doesn't really change, but they go through what's called the wet season or the dry season.
okay.
So that's more like your countries along the equator that get their rainy seasons and stuff.
I hear a lot about remote nursing. And I feel like there's a lot of northern nursing with that, but I could be wrong.
Yep. Well, you get remote nursing if you look at those. They're states, not provinces. But if you look at Queensland, Northern Territory, Western Australia, they're all very large, and right around in that center, that's where you get the remote nursing. Generally, you're dealing with Indigenous communities, and you may be one of two nurses for the next 600 to 900 kilometers. You do need to actually have special training for that. Agency nurses can be sent out, but you do need a higher level of education for it because you are it, essentially.
Yeah.
I have not done remote nursing before. Australia has a very they talk about rural versus remote. So for them, rural is anywhere outside of a major city for the next like 5 to 6 hours drive, and then past that, that's where you're getting more into remote.
Okay, that sounds pretty isolated. So I can see why you need to have that extra education and training.
Yep, absolutely,
Oh
absolutely.
my goodness. So we were talking before we got on here about the lack of any color being in Australia because you're I would have expected you to have a bit more of a, bronze sheen there.
To be fair, I am a little bit of redhead, so whatever color I win, I lose it pretty quickly. And being working from home lately hasn't helped with getting that sun. But you will see a lot of Australians, they're really big into being outdoors. There's beaches, I mean, the entire country is surrounded by water, and most of your cities and places where people live is right along the coast. So there's a lot of opportunities to go out to the beaches. They like to get out. That's one of the things that I really like about the Australian culture is for them, one of the most important things is to get out to go for coffee with friends. In fact, it's everybody is almost expected to buy a coffee out every day.
Oh,
And it's important for the nurses even that they get their breaks for coffee. It's a big cultural thing. It was I had some language confusion at first. My very first shift, they're like, "Have you had tea yet?" And I'm like, "Oh, I don't drink tea. It's okay." They're like, "No, no, no. Like, have you had your tea?" And I'm like, "No, I'm good." They're like, "No, dear, you need your tea." And then I eventually learned that for them, they have their tea breaks, but then they also have tea, which means dinner.
okay. I would not pick up on that either.
No. So yeah, there's some language concerns there, but coffee breaks or tea breaks in general are important to them because it's their time to sit down and have their cuppa of
Mhm.
coffee or tea and socialize, which is really nice.
Okay, I'm really glad you said kappa because the second thing I was going to say, first, there's the lack of the bronze, but two, where's the accent?
I know. I still can't even imitate the accent. It's just so different.
I was actually quite surprised when we first got on here. I'm like, you sound like you did years ago when we worked together. I would have expected to be a little bit of an influence in your intonation.
No, not. I don't know. It hasn't changed, and same with my boyfriend now husband. His accent is still the exact same as well. Although he started struggling to switch between using Canadian words versus Australian words when we talk to Canadian family versus Australian friends.
Right,
Um,
because there's some different things, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Which one stood out to you when you first got down there, other than tea and breaks?
Um, well, in regards to nursing, they were telling me I needed to give a bottle to every patient. And I'm like, what's a ball? What's a ball? They were saying bottle, which is a urinal, to the male patients for bedtime. I think I spent like half an hour trying to figure out what I needed to do.
In the storage room looking for this ball, this elusive ball.
um, but yeah, though there's other words. I find it's really interesting because they have obviously grown up with. There's Australian television, but there's a lot of American TV on their television as well. So whatever words I use that are from North America, they understand what I mean, but vice versa. Sometimes I struggle to understand their words. There's some simple stuff like instead of saying gas, that you need to fill up your car with gas, they say petrol. Um, one of the things they say is taking the piss all the time, which is making fun of someone. So if
Okay.
you're taking the piss out of something, you're making fun of someone. Sometimes they have weird things like they say fair dinkum, and I had to look that one up. So like fair dinkum is basically far out.
Well, it made me giggle. I like the word.
Yeah, yeah. And you can kind of sometimes understand just based on what you've been talking about. Like you get the you
Mm,
figure it out really quick.
get the
Uh,
gist.
yeah, but it's sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's more often I'm using the wrong words and not using the Australian words, but they'll just nod and smile and accept it. So I'll say, "Oh, can you throw that in the trash?" Whereas for them, it's the bin.
Mm.
So you get the odd one that goes, "Do you mean the bin?" And I'm like, "Yes." Or I did make one mistake once, because now that I work at a college, I was talking to one of the staff members and I said we needed to order 100 binders for the students. Well, turns out binders to them are where you put rings on a book, whereas a folder is what
They
our
put
typical binder is. And so they almost ordered 100
rings.
rings as opposed to the actual binders that I wanted. And I was like, oh man, all right, that's where language becomes a concern.
Who would have thought, hey?
Yep, yep.
My goodness. It sounds like there could be some very interesting stories in your travels there. When you went there for the first year, I just wanted to come back and you had to come back to Canada. You were back in Canada for 2 years?
Yes, I was. Yes,
Was your then boyfriend still in Australia studying?
yes, he was. He was. So I did a lot of travel back and forth during our holidays and during the annual leave and stuff. So it was challenging, but we made it work.
Hmm.
Uh, with technology nowadays, it's really good. And the time zones between Australia and Canada, you do have a block of about 5 hours where you can talk to Canadians from Australia. I
Hmm.
find I've got a cousin in England, and matching up Australia and British time zones are much, much more difficult.
Oh,
We have
interesting.
about a 1 hour period in the day that we can match up, and otherwise she's sleeping or I'm sleeping or we're at work.
Hmm. Was there a reason why you stayed in Canada 2 years? Like, did it take that long to get the paperwork to move back to Australia?
So the reason I returned to Canada was because my visa had expired, the work holiday visa, and you're only eligible to get that once in your life, and it needs to be done before you're 30 years old.
Well,
Um,
there goes my dream.
actually, you know what? I think last year they might there was talk about them pushing it back to 35.
Girl, do you know
But
how old I am? That was very kind of you to say, but I'm not in that age range.
just saying. So the issue is I needed to look into other visas, and the other visa options are you're basically limited to two. Well, three actually. So you can get your tourist visa, which is valid for 3 months at a time. Only you're only allowed in the country for 3 months, and you're not allowed to work. Then there is sponsorship options, and you can either sponsor yourself or you can find an employer to sponsor you. Both of those avenues are very intense and challenging.
Mm.
So it took me 2 years of, I really liked what I was doing in Canada anyway, so I was comfortable there, and I was finishing my master's. So we had a lot going on in our lives at the time, which is why it took the full time. But I was also humming and hawing about, what would be the best route. And in the end, I went to Australia on a 3-month tourist visa and applied for jobs, knowing full well that in 3 months, if I couldn't find sponsorship, I'd be kicked out of the country.
Mm.
It was actually very challenging to find a sponsor. I did find one eventually on a medical ward, and it ended up being a wonderful experience. But I was very nervous at the time because I'm quite mindful of the fact that a foreigner. Um, and one of the criteria is you must be employed full time. And a lot of nursing jobs in Australia aren't full time because the nurses here just don't, they prefer having a life over work. And with doing only 8-hour shifts, they don't really do 12-hour shifts in most places here. So doing full-time 8-hour shifts where you're doing late evenings and then have to come back early mornings, it's quite exhausting. So it was hard to find a full-time job. And then when I was offered a full-time job, I was kind of questioning, why did nobody else apply for this?
Mm.
To the fact that because they have to have proof that they've tried to hire locals before they're allowed to sponsor an international nurse.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, which makes it that, and they've cracked down on that since I got that job even more so. So it is very difficult to find sponsorship here. But I got it. And then you have to do some paperwork and the workplace has to do some paperwork, and then the workplace has to pay a little bit of money and you have to pay a little bit of money. We're talking a few $1,000s. So just something to be mindful of, that it's going to cost that visa. Then once you're sponsored by the workplace, you're sponsored for anywhere from 2 to 4 years to work in that workplace. But the catch is you are actually restricted to that workplace, meaning if you don't like the job or if they don't like you and want to let you go, you're out of the country. Which was a little bit nerve-wracking for me. It was a wonderful job, but as soon as I was eligible, I started applying for permanent residency, because once you're a permanent resident, you have the same rights as a citizen. You can work anywhere you'd like. You're not limited.
Mm-hmm. That's actually really interesting. I do know a few students, past students from Norquest, who have found work in Australia. One went with an agency from Canada, was hired into an agency there. The other one just recently popped up on Facebook, moved there on her own, got her own job. So I'm wondering if she's in the same predicament that you've just painted, where she's going to be committed to that institution or that facility for 2 to 4 years.
Yeah, yeah, very, very likely. You Agencies generally don't hire for sponsorship. So they generally do the work visa, which, going back to the work holiday visa, sorry, that there's something important to note about that, is you cannot work for a facility for more than 6 months in a row for one workplace. So that's not just applying to nurses, it's applying to any person on a work holiday visa. And the reason for that is the government's idea of you coming over on a work holiday visa is you're working for the purpose of traveling. If you're working full time for the next 12 months in one job, you're not working to travel. So that's their way. And so that's why a lot of nurses choose agency nursing, because they send you out to different hospitals and those different hospitals then pay you, which means you're not working at one particular hospital for an extended 6-month period of time, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And I think the agency, so if you get hired as an agency, and I don't know if you know much about it because you went there on a different pathway, that isn't it a year as well, and then you have to come back? I felt like the student who went there before was there for a year, and then she decided to actually move there. Maybe it was just she was planning on staying there only for a year, but
She still would have needed to get work holiday visa separate from the agency. So I had the same thing where I was nervous about going on a work holiday visa without a job. So I contacted an agency in advance before I went to Australia, and they said, yeah, get your work holiday visa. And when you rock up, in the country, come see us and we'll offer you a job, essentially. So yeah, and it's a revolving door with agency nurses. Nurses come in and then 12 months later they leave the agency. They're used to that.
Mm. Interesting. So in terms of there's a few different ways you can get to Australia if you're interested in going there for nursing. You talked that there's a bit of a financial commitment. There are
Yes,
some
definitely.
timelines to be mindful of, and maybe some contractual obligations to be mindful of as well.
Yep.
Do they help you find housing? Do they help? Like, what about the licensing fees? How does it work there compared to here?
Yep. So you do have to be a registered nurse to go to Australia. They
I will
you were
just I will just share with you that the two that I know that are there are LPNs.
really okay.
Yeah,
Did
yeah.
they
So
do any extra education?
that I don't know. I just know that they're LPNs, both of them that are working there.
Okay. All right. Well, that's really good to know because I was under the impression that you had to have at least 3 years of education um, to come to Australia, but that could have changed since I applied for it. The main thing is there's a lot of paperwork that needs to be collected. And so my biggest recommendation for anybody who's thinking of going to Australia is you need to have collect a course description of every course you've ever done, which is a lot of work, and especially if it's been a few years since you've done those courses.
Mhm.
And so there's one licensing body across the entire country. I know Canada has talked about it, but never actually moved towards doing it. Australia actually did it a few years ago. Um, so one licensing body called OPRA. They also license doctors, allied health professionals, as well as nurses. And what you do is, although there is OPRA is national across the country, you choose what state you're going to start working in, and that's the state that you send your initial documents to and you have the correspondence with. But you aren't limited to working only in that state. Um, they've just moved into an online format over the past few months, or the past 6 months, something like that. And things have changed a little bit, but it is a lot of you, you have to collect a lot of documentation. I know it took me about 6 months to go through collecting all the documentation, particularly because there was delays through my university. I had to get my university to send specific documentations direct to OPRA without me being a middle person, and then I had to follow that up. You also need to get a lot of paperwork photocopied and what's the term where you get a justice of the peace or you get somebody to
Notarized.
actually notarized. Yeah,
Mhm.
you have to get it notarized, which can be quite expensive too. So overall, I think I spent uh, about $1,000 just on getting the paperwork together and sent over, and then there's a licensing fee on top of that when you do get approved. Once they offer you the license, you have 3 months to show up in the country for it to be valid, which is kind of, I see this all the time with the nurses on Facebook that are in the process because it takes months to collect the documentation. Once you get it sent to OPRA, there can be anywhere from a 3 to 6 month delay on their part of processing, but they expect that the second they approve you, you've got to show up in the country within 3 months. So you do have to kind of get all your ducks in a row in Canada that you can leave relatively quickly when you
Mhm.
need to.
Mhm. Yeah, and you do have to physically show up at the location. It's not mailed to you. You have to physically show up to collect it, as I understand it.
They just want to see you face to face. So the actual license is emailed to you,
Okay.
but I think they want to make sure you're a real person
Mhm.
and that you do have intentions of being in the country to work as a nurse.
Yeah. Do you have to do licensing fees every year like you do here?
Yep,
That's
yep.
the same.
Um, and that's one thing that I got caught with this, and a lot of nurses do. I moved here in what was it, February, and paid for the licensing fees, got my license, and guess what? Their annual license renews in March. So I paid the full fee in February, and in March I had to pay the full fee again.
They didn't even have a reduced rate for you in February?
$600 both times.
All right, so note, make sure you plan to go in the spring after March.
I know, I know. It's not something you can really like plan. It's like a punch in the gut, essentially. And I've seen so many posts on Facebook with nurses, always around February, March. They're posting going, "Do I actually have to pay this again?" And the answer is yes,
Oh my
unfortunately.
goodness. It sounds like there's a strong community on Facebook for people looking to transition.
There really is. And that's something that I didn't know when I first came over. It's but I've joined since, and I actually talk to nurses that are looking, particularly Canadian nurses that are looking to come over, just to give them tips and stuff. But generally, it's really funny because a lot of the groups are actually run by the agency nursing groups. So of course they're kind of looking to recruit, but at the same time they allow it to be a forum for information for nurses that are trying to come over, which is really, really good. So half the time the nurses that are on these groups don't even realize that it's an agency that's kind of moderating it.
I think that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah, as
Well,
an agency, that's your warm market. You just know who's looking, and if a name comes across your desk, you're like, okay, I know this person, their values, their character, like that's the kind of person I want to have. I think that's brilliant.
yeah, and to be honest, the agencies, because their biggest chunk of workers are foreign nurses, they're very familiar with the visa process, the requirements, that sort of stuff. We're not talking official government level knowledge, but they do have a general idea that they can explain stuff to you, which is quite helpful.
Mhm.
And they
I can't remember if there was a commitment with agency. I feel like there was a year commitment, maybe.
no, they do put some rules in place. They want you to commit to at least picking up one shift per month.
Is that it?
That's it. That's it.
I've had some beginning conversations because I thought, I really am curious. I'd love to explore the world a little bit more, but I couldn't remember if they had said there was a an expectation.
No. The thing with agency is they treat you as well as you treat them. So I found that if you were really, because like I said, it's office staff that you're talking with that are coordinating getting your shifts and stuff, right? So if you're really polite, respectful, and you're picking up lots of shifts, they're willing to offer you the better shifts.
Hmm.
Whereas if you're only going for that one shift a month and you're not communicating with them, you're not going to get a lot of offers of shifts either.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, you help each other out essentially.
Fair enough. I think what I remember now is there was a travel reimbursement fund, and you had to work so many hours within so many months to get your flight reimbursed up to a certain dollar amount. Yes, that's what it was.
Yeah, they often have deals like that.
Yeah. And it wasn't even that bad. I didn't think it was that bad, even. I forget what it was, 500 hours in 6 months, maybe? I don't know. Does
Yeah,
that sound like a lot?
no, no. So one thing to be mindful of with agency nursing, like even right now, well, we've got the coronavirus going on, and Australia has been doing really well with it, which means there's actually not a lot of agency shifts available. So you do need to have savings to come to Australia, and with the mindset that you might not be able to get work for weeks at a time. Some weeks you'll be slammed with lots of work, and other weeks you will have no work at all. So you kind of have to be mindful of that, especially if you're paying rent and that sort of stuff, transportation.
Sure. So that leads nicely into cost of living comparisons.
Yeah. With regards to that, Australia is more expensive to live in than Canada. Um, an example would be that as a single person going to the grocery store, I spend about $25 more per week on groceries. So that's something to keep in mind. In regards to rent, I rented a room initially on the outskirts of Melbourne. Melbourne's a city of 4 million people,
Wow.
and they charge per week here. So for a single room in a house in the boonies, essentially, of the city, I was paying $300 a week, which is $1,200.
1,200 a month. Mm.
And that didn't include utilities or bills or internet.
Okay. What about the wages? Are they comparable?
So minimum wage here is $20 an hour.
Okay.
It's actually age based. Sorry, it's like $19 an hour if you are 16, and if you're over 20, it's like $23 an hour, something like that. Um, So your minimum wage in general is higher, which obviously then corresponds to the increased cost of living. In terms of nursing pay, um, it's almost on par with Canada's, except as an agency nurse, you get paid a lot more. Just like supply teachers in Canada make a lot more money, so do agency nurses.
Mm-hmm.
So you're generally looking at double the pay. Now, it does depend on a lot of factors. Different agencies pay different amounts. They obviously take a cut off the top. If you're working a private hospital versus a public hospital, pays differently as well. Private hospitals tend to pay more, and then of course you get your night shift premiums and your weekend premiums. Um, and as an agency nurse, if you have expertise in a few select clinical areas, you get more money as well. So emergency nursing and ICU pay more.
Those are my backgrounds. See, now you're making me reconsider.
Exactly. So the weekend night shifts that I picked up in an emergency department in a private hospital, so it's all very specific,
Yeah.
I was making $75 an hour.
Okay.
However, if I was working in a public hospital rehab ward on a weekday, I was making about $42 an hour.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It is, and it because there's so many factors that come into play. It's really hard to keep track of that.
Hmm. And it sounds like it's a bit complicated to even know then week to week what your income is going to be, because you don't know if you're going to be at that rehab center or the emerge center.
Yeah, no, there is definitely no way to keep track of that. So one of the biggest things I find that nurses are asking on Facebook when they're looking to come over is how much money should I bring? Um, and my answer to that is always $5,000 in savings. And the reason is you have to pay first and last month's rent right off the bat. That cuts out half of that money. And then you've got food costs, transportation costs, and then you always want to make sure that you've got some savings just in case there's no shifts to pick up,
Mm-hmm.
or you don't know if you're going to work on one of the cheaper wards or one of the higher paying ones. So
Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting. I think you've provided a lot of great information for people considering a transition to Australia. Lots of different routes to get there, different specialties, and how that can impact your income and cost of living and things like that. Is there anything we maybe didn't touch on that you think would be important for those to know?
I found I think maybe the way the healthcare system here is run and what the expectations are for nurses. So Australia actually has a dual healthcare system, private and public, which coming from a Canadian perspective, I wasn't sure what private would be like. And I am now totally sold on having a dual healthcare system. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of the American side where it's just like the American system where it's only privatization.
Mm,
But in terms of both, there are a lot of clear advantages. With regards to nursing, you would think that nursing in a private system would actually be easier, but it's the opposite. They have better ratios of nurse to patients in the public system than they do in the private, and that's because the private wants to make more money, of
mhm.
course. However, your patients that can afford private insurance tend to be, um, healthier in general, so they're less physically sick.
Yeah.
There are so you kind of weigh out the ratios in that sense. Um, the private systems are more willing to pay agency nurses, so you tend to get a lot of work in the private
I
system.
was just going to ask, I would have assumed the agencies would have been for the public.
Nope, mostly private. However, so the public tend to stack up their casual banks more. Um, but having been employed permanently on a ward now in Australia, they're not allowed based on union contracts to work short staffed, which means they will do everything in their power to get another nurse there. They'll start with casual banks. If they can't do that, they'll see if their nurses can work double shifts because they do the 8-hour shifts. And if they can't do that, then they'll desperately try to get an agency nurse. So I can say confidently that having worked full-time on a medical ward for 3 years now here, I have never once worked short-staffed,
Wow.
which is unheard of from my experiences in Canada.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I take students, as you know, I'm still clinically teaching and we go into the hospital all the time. And not that they're always short staffed. They are sometimes, but they always say that they don't know how they could do it without the students coming in. So I don't know if there's a similar sentiment there, but there are days where they're just like, what? We have to pull one of our nurses to go over to their unit? Like we're going to be short staffed? So,
Yep, yep. So that doesn't happen here. The nurses, I've heard it said time and time again that the nurses here are backwards, and I don't like that term. But what people mean is that nursing in Australia is like what nursing was 20 years ago in Canada, where the doctors did more of the clinical skills and the nurses did less.
interesting.
So yeah, I don't call it, it's not backwards, but it is different. So for example, there are a lot of hospitals where the nurses aren't allowed to put in male catheters, only doctors can. And a lot of times the doctors will put in the catheter into females as well, like urinary drainage catheters. In terms of putting IV cannulas in people, you have to have a little bit of additional training from your hospital, but the hospitals don't push it because the doctors do it for the most part. I had a patient who needed a nasogastric tube inserted, and the doctor came to do it. And I was like, I'm fully capable of doing this, but go ahead. So yeah, in that sense, the nurses do a little bit different work when you have a code happening, particularly on the wards. Again, the doctors are the ones that tend to take over. The nurses, like in terms with medications and IV and that sort of stuff, unless you're an ICU nurse. So there's just some pretty drastic differences that way, and less autonomy of the nurses. So if you have a patient who's not doing well, I didn't realize how much autonomy nurses had in Canada with regards to making decisions. Whereas in Australia, it's very strict criteria. You must call a doctor if if your patient's respiratory rate is above this number, you absolutely must call the doctor and let them make the decision. So there's been quite a few times where I've called the doctors being like, I'm calling you because my patient's respiratory rate is 28, but I'm not worried about them, and I'm just calling you because I have to. So things like that.
That is really quite amazing. It does feel like a different world. I don't know if I would adjust to that.
I do have to say, it actually, in a sense, it was hard to wrap my brain around it, but I actually feel that because of that, the doctors are better trained in Australia because they actually have a much better understanding of that sort of stuff. Whereas in Canada, you never really saw the doctors have the understandings of catheterization, of doing bloods or taking blood work or putting an IV cannula in people or giving medications and dosages. The doctors in Canada don't have as much experience, whereas here they do.
Yeah,
So
the relationship sounds like it's rather unique then as well.
yeah, it is. It is. There is a little bit of overlap in the skills here that the doctors and nurses can do in terms, like I said, sometimes the nurses catheterize, sometimes the nurses put IV cannulas in. So there is actually a little bit of stress with that, where a lot of the nurses here just go right to the doctor and ask them to do it without trying themselves, even if they have had the training.
Mm.
Whereas, you don't see that in Canada because the nurses would try and try and try again because they know the doctors can't do it.
Or they're too busy to do it. Let's give them that grace.
Fair enough, fair enough.
But this has made me wonder, how does the patient respond then when a nurse comes in to do these tasks that are typically physician-led? Are they comfortable with the nurse putting in the catheter? Are they comfortable with the nurse putting the IV in?
The patients don't actually know that.
Okay.
They don't know what the doctors versus the nurses do.
Okay.
Um, really doesn't have an impact.
So no problem.
No, no problem.
I imagine a nurse feeling like, I have to justify why I'm doing this for you today and not the doctor, but I guess that doesn't exist.
No, just like in Canada, the nurses, if a doctor came in to put an IV cannula in a patient's arm, the patient wouldn't know any better that that's normally a nurse's job if nobody spoke up or said anything.
Very interesting. That was a really good insight into the protocols and the procedures to get your little bum out of this cold Canada weather and into that beautiful sun in Australia.
Yep, yep, absolutely.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure that those who have been looking at it, which will be many, will appreciate having that insight from someone who's already taken that journey.
Yeah, not a worry. It's I love talking about it because I know how scary it was when I first came over. So,
Mhm,
thank
mhm. Well, and you've done well for yourself.
you.
Awesome. Once again, thanks to Louise for joining us on Frontline Nursing Podcast. Now, if you'd like to see the video of this interview and get the behind the scenes content, head on over to the frontlinepodcast.com membership area and access that content. And if you have a story you'd like to share, email me at info@tammydonna.com. We would love to have you on the show.